Welcome to the Power of One. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with a gentleman by the name of Greg, who is doing some amazing things at the White House. I met Greg at the Eagles Summit in Philly, and
hmm
I went right up to him and I said, listen, I need you to be on my show because this is something new for the White House. And we want to hear about all the amazing things that are going on because gun violence affects all of us in one way or another. So thank you so much for joining me today, Greg.
No problem. Thanks for having me. I'm on the road here, so I apologize if the background's a little wild. I don't have my fancy suit on today.
No, that's okay. We want to be relaxed and we want to be real because you and I know that's what people like. They like genuine people. So we just want
Yeah,
to have a conversation today. Tell me
great.
all about the Office of Gun Violence Prevention at the White House.
Yes, our office is about 14 months old at this point. And we were created because this is one of the top priorities for President Biden and Vice President Harris. As you may know, during the prior administration, we saw the steepest increase in homicides in American history. And this is something that the president wanted to lean directly into. And he was actually the first president in history to name gun violence as a
Mm.
public health crisis and decided to take action. First, by doing all he can within the powers of the White House, he actually executed 54 executive actions. So everything from investing more dollars into youth violence prevention programs to cracking down on gun trafficking to regulating gun sellers, but really taking action was something he did really within the first few weeks of the Biden Harris administration. And then in 2022, we actually passed the first law on gun violence in 29 years, the Bipartisan Safer
Mm.
Communities Act. And that bill had over 14 different major policy changes and $15 billion of resources to help prevent violence. And so after all these executive actions were announced, this historic, really ground shaking bill was passed. The community and advocates across the country said, well, we need a team to implement this as soon as possible because every day that these ideas are not implemented, we're losing lives and we're losing our family members and our neighbors. And the president responded and he created the first ever White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention in September of 2023. And I was so thankful to be appointed as deputy director of that office. And it's been an amazing ride ever since. I come to this work as a survivor of gun violence, but
Mm.
someone who also has worked in the policy space and really helped push a lot of the policies that came through the Biden Harris administration. And now I'm on the other side, making sure those ideas become real life saving strategies that are working for our people every day.
That's amazing. Amazing. Let's talk a little bit about ghost guns. That to me
hmm
is just deep. So, how does your office help with that issue? It just boggles my mind that
Yeah,
someone can make a gun in their home or
yeah.
even order parts offline. So, what is your office doing about ghost guns?
Yeah, well, ghost guns is a huge problem across the country, but this administration saw that. And actually, in 2021, the Biden Harris administration started to crack down on ghost guns. And this was the first time that the federal government has even leaned into ghost guns, let alone launching a full scale initiative on this. And so the first step was figuring out what is the problem? How are these ghost guns being built? Where are the sources? And so we tasked the ATF with to research and figure out what exactly is happening and how it's playing out. And then second, we rolled out historic regulations. We actually said that, hey, if you're selling these kits that can be built into a gun, then you need to
Mhm.
be implementing background checks. You need to check to make sure the buyer is of age. You need to be just as responsible with your sales as a company that's selling a fully built and assembled firearm. And
Mhm.
so we went from all of these manufacturers now are at the same standard as manufacturers that are selling fully assembled built guns. And I'm proud to say that the ones that some of them stepped up, but the largest one, Polymer 180, actually went out of business because they said that, hey, we can't keep up with all of these regulations, considering the profit margin of our products. And, we know that, hey, if you can't do this the right way, then our opinion is you shouldn't do it at all.
That's
Because
right.
these are the guns that are showing up at crime scenes. These are the guns that are causing harm and getting into the hands of those who are prohibited, whether it's a domestic abuser or someone that's too young. But this
Mhm.
administration has been laser focused on ghost guns, and we've had a significant impact in reducing the presence of them across the country. The sad part is that a lot of them are already out into our communities, right? And so we can slow down the flow of new ghost guns, but we still have to
Right.
think about how do we prevent violence with those that are out there already.
That are out there. Right, right. That is amazing work. So you are helping people across the United States, which is amazing. How do you tackle the gun violence in different states and cities? Like, I'll speak about Philly, of course, because I know about
Yeah.
Philly. And with me being the executive director for Northwest Victim Services, we are a small nonprofit, and we find that the small nonprofits are often the ones that are the boots on the ground. And when I tell you it's only
Yeah.
four of us, and we're serving well over 2,000 people, but we don't get the money to be able to
Hmm.
serve those who really are in need. So when you go to these different states and cities and you see, okay, they have a whole lot more gun violence than this state. What do you guys do with that information? Do you take it back to the president and the vice president and say, okay, listen, we really need to help this city. We really need to help this state because their gun violence is just unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, at this point, there has been so little done on the issue of gun violence that most of the solutions that we push for can help every community. Just to give you a little context, I mean, President Biden rolled out 54 executive actions. The previous two presidents, Trump and Obama, only did four, right? So we are making huge sweeping changes that will help every single community. But we are focusing in on those who are most impacted. And one of the major executive actions the president did was to change 26 grants in total of $10 billion to
Mm,
prioritize communities that are most impacted by violence. So, for
mhm.
example, one is called Youth Build with the Department of Labor that provides grants for job training and economic opportunity assistance for local nonprofits. Well, our executive actions made sure that if your community is being impacted by violence, that you get a higher level score and you are front of the line when it comes to winning that grant. And so we did that with 26 grants across the country. And that was our first major step to make sure that dollars are getting to communities most impacted. Secondly, the president charged us with looking at states, as you mentioned, and we rolled out what's called the Safer States Initiative, where we laid out 15 major policy changes that we know can reduce violence. We brought together state legislators. We invited all 50 states, 37 states showed up, and we brought them all together and said, hey, here are the things we can do to save lives, and here's where your state is at. And even states like California that think they've done it all, they think they've passed every progressive law you can imagine. Even they have work to do. And so
Right.
we rolled out these policies, gave them essentially a report card. And each of those states, we tasked them with going back. And the vice president herself challenged them face to face with going back and moving forward these policies. And I'm really proud to share that 31 of those states moved forward different policies, and 17 of them actually passed new laws in response to our
That's awesome.
charge. And part of that was providing more resources for victims of gun violence. Part of it was investing in community violence intervention, and not just, and also investing in mental health resources and services. So the policies weren't just regulations around firearms, it was also around prioritizing investments into prevention strategies and supporting families that are most impacted. So that's what we've done at the state level. And then the last big piece is at the city level, we rolled out what's called our Safer Cities Initiative, which we're hoping to expand. And frankly, we don't have a lot of time now, 80 days. We were hoping to do more with it. But with that, we're partnering with specific mayors to make sure they understand all the policies and resources that are laid out before them. We're working with their team to help develop better data and tracking of not only where violence is happening, but where are your resources and assets, right? If this community has been impacted by the most homicides, do they also have the most economic opportunity? Do they also have the best education opportunity? Do they also have access to public safety and trust with law enforcement and resources for their community-based nonprofits? So that type of hard work of really assessing what exists in those cities is what we're doing with cities now. And frankly, the next phase is partnering those cities with federal agencies to figure out how do you resource it. If you don't have a rec center, then how can you partner with the Department of Interior and bring dollars in for more safe spaces? So those are kind of three things that we've been doing is looking at federal grants and making sure they're prioritizing communities most impacted, working with state legislators to get major state legislation passed, and then with cities, kind of really more deeper support with mayors specifically, ensuring they get the resources they need. We're actually going to Memphis next Friday to help them open their first ever Office of Gun Violence Prevention. And that's something we've been working with them on for about six months now. And so we're excited to kick that off and support them as they start to lean into this issue more.
That's awesome. So within the 80 days, I will gladly
Yeah.
accept my invitation to sit down with you and the vice president to give you guys some more information. So you just ponder on that for a minute. So let's talk about untreated trauma,
Mhm.
especially for these young people. Now,
Yeah.
in Philly, I don't know if you know everything that's going on in Philly. It breaks my heart that there are young African American males that look like you and me that are 15 that are being shot multiple times.
Yeah.
That's unbelievable. It was a time when women and children were off limits. And I don't know if you remember that, but that's no more. So now we're seeing, and this has been probably over the last 4 to 5 years, where
Yeah.
females are being shot and killed. But I can't understand for the life of me how a 14, 15, or 16-year-old is shot multiple times and killed. Untreated trauma, mental illness within the African American community. How does your office deal with that?
Well, this is really personal to me. I was one of those individuals. I was shot in 2013, and the bullet that hit me hit two arteries. And the physical trauma is one thing, but the emotional, mental trauma is a whole nother level. And
Mhm,
not just me, but what it did to my little brother, to my
mhm.
cousins, to my nephews, to my parents. Right, that trauma is real.
Yeah.
Um, and when we think about what's happening to our Black youth, this is not a new problem. This is we talk a lot about in America how gun violence is number one cause of death for youth in America. Well, it's been the number one cause for Black youth since
Hmm.
2006, right?
Hmm.
So this has been a huge crisis for quite a while. And unfortunately, the American government approach has been let's go get the bad guy, let's go lock him up and
Hmm.
not think about the trauma, not think about how did someone get here in the first place, and how do we help people heal and recover so we can break this cycle of violence that happens when someone retaliates or they carry that trauma with them and someone else, pushes them the wrong way, right?
Hmm.
So we're attacking it very differently. So one of our major priority is resourcing victim services. So recognizing that when someone is harmed or injured, for me, when I was shot, I had $22,000 in hospital bills. Then there
Hmm.
are dollars to help reimburse folks for those financial costs of just the physical care. But we're also
Right.
working on expanding what those dollars can be used for, and specifically ensuring that mental health and therapy can be included in your usage of the Crime Victims Fund. That if you have any type of major property damage, because we know that's a real situation when someone's entire car is shot up, and that's the only car
Exactly.
they have to go to work with.
That's right.
That's important. And so making sure that we expand those dollars to be more inclusive of what the needs are of individuals. But then we think about the long-term trauma. We have to think about how do we provide more mental health resources for our youth. And this administration actually made the largest investment in youth mental health. We created the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline that now we've had over 10 million Americans use. But it's essentially you can call in just like 911 if you need a helping
Right.
hand. And there are certified specialists there to talk you through that moment of crisis and to get you the support you need while kind of triaging, right? Helping you in that
Mhm.
very crucial moment as we think about long term care. That was something this administration did. We also invested funds for 14,000 additional school based mental health professionals. And these aren't just like, therapists in a coat. In some schools, these are guidance counselors, right? In some schools, these are your coaches, right? These are people who are being trained on mental health special needs and how to support people that are in mental health crisis or struggling. But many of them have multiple hats. And we know that having someone in your school system that you know, that you trust, that you see every day, but also is professionally trained to help you can go a long ways, and it's not as simple as sitting down in a room with a talk therapist. Sometimes you just need someone that's already close to you. And especially in our communities where we don't have access or resources or even the cultural norms to go sit down with a therapist, it might have to be that football coach, right? That helps you think through the trauma you're dealing with and how to navigate it properly. So those are a couple major steps that we've taken. I mean, these are historic investments financially, but we know it's just the beginning, and we have to think about how can we do more. And we're pushing our states to do more. I mean, in Colorado this week, they just passed a new law that all firearm sales are being taxed, and the taxes from those dollars go directly into victim services, right? So the industry itself is funding resources for those who have been traumatized. And so we have to keep leaning into that. But we also have to make sure that we just think about how do we connect with youth, understand the problems they have, and try to prevent violence before it happens. Recognizing that we're not in an era where it's about gangs. Only 11% of homicides are gang related now. It's not even connected to crime. Only 29% of homicides in the Black community are connected to another felony. Right now, it is interpersonal conflict with the access or the presence of a firearm. That's what's fueling violence. It's not this what we saw in the 90s, this big organized larger problem. And a lot of that does come back to, like you said, trauma, people untreated trauma, carrying that frustration, that pain, that aggression with them, and then being, tipped off or by a argument or a fight or yelling over a girl or relationship.
Exactly. Like, how do you kill somebody over some words? But you're
Yeah.
right. You're right.
But it's
You're right.
unfortunately
And you
our
spoke
youth
about
is too many folks that are ticking time bombs right now, and that's
they
because of
are.
all that they've been through. And the last
Yeah,
thing you want to do is put a firearm in their hand, right?
exactly.
And
Yeah.
and unfortunately, that's what's happened in our country. And so we have to, one, help treat folks so they don't explode over something small, and then second, we have to keep guns away from those who we know are in that situation. And that's kind of the two-pronged approach for our office.
That's true. And another reason why I need to sit in front of you and Vice President Harris is because you touched on something when you spoke on somebody's car being shot up. See, now
Hmm.
under victims compensation, that's property damage. Do you know how many
Hmm.
carjacking victims there are in the city of Philadelphia? There's this gentleman by the name of Raymond, and I told him I am not going to stop fighting for him. It has been almost 2 years. This man was not only carjacked, he was also rolled over his car by the carjackers. He was in the hospital for about a month and maybe a week or 2 weeks. When he got out of the hospital, he received our mail from Northwest Victim Services. He called me and said to me, Melanie, my car is on a paid lot. And he
Hmm.
could not get his car off that paid lot. It was probably almost $1,000, a little less, for him to get his car. I called the lot owner and he said his car has been on my lot for a long time. If he does not get it today, I'm selling it. That man lost his car. He
Hmm.
cannot, he couldn't afford to get it back, first of all. But even if he could, that money is not reimbursable through the Victims Compensation Program, which I love the Victims Compensation Program. My brother was carjacked probably a year or so ago in Philly, coming from the barbershop, gun held to his head, knocked in the head.
Hmm.
The car was recovered in Chester. My dad and I had to ride to Chester to get my brother's car. My dad paid almost $900 off of a paid lot to get
Yeah.
his car back. We are re-victimizing victims. So I say that to say it's a great idea to have the boots on the ground agencies at the table when some of these changes are being made. But I am still fighting for Raymond because I know that
Hmm.
Philly has a city code that it's like the towing fee and then it is put on, it could be put on a lot, but they have to pay almost, I want to say about $300, give or take a few dollars, for them to get their car back. But that's
Hmm.
not right. You know what I mean? So this is what I do. I fight for victims and co-homicide survivors every day, all day. What I do is not a job for me. It's my passion and I love what I do. So when you're ready to really talk about that discussion and you need somebody at the table, please call me because I am coming. And that leads me into my next question. What does your
Hmm.
office do to connect with the small community-based agencies in different states?
Yeah, I mean, that's honestly a real challenge. I think what we've done from a White House level is we recognize kind of our role. Our role is to unlock federal resources to make larger, sweeping policy changes. But we need more infrastructure at the state and local level to best engage everybody that's needed. And that's why we've been pushing really hard for cities to create their own offices of gun violence prevention, for states to create statewide offices, and really to build an ecosystem to partner and connect. Because even what you were sharing, there were some real challenges that you shared about the support for Raymond that the federal government can't touch, right? But that's a city policy, that's a state policy. And that's why we need leaders at all three levels, the same way we do with Department of Justice and Department of Education. We need leadership at all three levels that's thinking about how do we best support victims, that thinks about how do we deal with gun trafficking and imports and gun sales and regulation. And that's something we've been pushing for. And I am really proud to say when we started, there were only 7 statewide offices. Now there are 11, and 4 of which we played a really close hand in. Pennsylvania being one of them. Y'all have a new office that's being built
We
and set
do.
up right now.
We do.
Yeah, and so we're proud of that. North Carolina is another one, Colorado, and so we're trying to get states to do that. But then with cities, as I shared, next week we're going to be launching Memphis. We're trying to get cities to build that infrastructure too, because frankly, the White House can't touch all this issue right now. There's 40,000 people dying a year,
Mm.
over 150,000 people shot or injured, and it's happening in nearly every community across the country. And so there's no way we would have the bandwidth. But what we can do is release dollars, release
Mhm.
shift policies, and empower states and cities. But in the meantime, we are doing engagements. We've done national engagement of mothers who've lost their loved ones to talk about victim services. We brought together youth that have survived school shootings to help us think about active shooter drills. We brought together domestic violence survivors and leaders to help us build out a better strategy for the intersection of domestic violence and gun violence. We even brought together health system CEOs to say, hey, this is what hospitals need to do. And here's how you can be a better partner with communities. We're actually, right now, we're working on a big convening of hospitality and restaurant chain leadership and saying, look, your clients, your customers are being impacted by violence. You need to be partnered with local organizations and local groups, whether it's a fast food chain or a delivery service. This is part of the problem that's impacting your bottom line, and you have to partner locally. And so, as a White House, we're trying to bring together these larger groups to help think through ideas, but also seeing if we can push them to strengthen their local relationships in ways that we know we can't do. And even if we could do, our time is limited, right? And so,
Right.
how do we start to get everyone to partner better at the local level, even when the White House isn't at the table?
Yeah. Well, you guys are doing an amazing job. And let's speak about
Thank you.
something that saddens our heart. And it seems like it happens every year and maybe a couple of times a year. Mass shootings that happen in schools. How on
Mhm.
earth do we prevent that?
You know, Mass shootings are a terrible thing, and it's something that really just violates a space that should be safe, hands down. Our children should be able to go to school, learn, build friends and family and relationships in the school system without the threat of being shot or harmed. And now we literally have a crisis in our country where nearly every school is doing active shooter drills, whereas we might have had fire drills.
Right.
They're being
Exactly.
taught to duck and hide in closets and under desks, and it's a huge tragedy. And you know, the but I think what we have done is we've learned what happens, and fortunately, school shootings are very predictable. We know that 98% of the folks who commit these heinous acts, you can see them coming. You can see them coming. There's already some type of flags before, there's some type of breakdown, there's some type of manuscript. They've literally talked about it or told their friends about it. And what we haven't always had is the tools. And if you think about what happened in Winder, Georgia, for example, the year before FBI was at his house, right? And so we know, unfortunately, well, fortunately, we know when someone's going down this path. We just haven't had enough tools to help disrupt or intervene before tragedy strikes. And that's been a big focus of ours, is making sure we have extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws where we can remove the firearms if we know someone's in crisis. And in states like Florida, they've used this already over 12,000 times, right? So this is a tool that we know is saving lives every day. We've also enhanced our background check system, that if you want to buy a firearm under the age of 21, we now are going to look at your mental health records, and we're going to look at your juvenile criminal history, not to incarcerate you or charge you, but if we see flags there, you will be denied. And since then, we've actually denied, just this year alone, over 900 attempted purchasers. And these are people who have suicide ideology, who have serious concerns or violent histories. We had one person who attempted to buy a gun, and when we checked with local law enforcement, found out that he was already locked up for attempted murder, right? We had another person who was involuntarily admitted for suicidal actions, who had a gun purchase application pending, right? So we're able to now at least make sure the guns are not there. But the next big thing is we have to make sure that youth are in crisis have the resources they need way before it gets to that point. And that's why the mental health programs are so critical. And so we think a combination of more mental health resources for our youth and making sure we have more tools to remove firearms or prevent you from getting a firearm in the first place when we see these big warning signs are huge. And frankly, it's been working. This year, we've seen a 24% reduction in mass shootings. And if you think about school shootings, we're hitting historic lows. If even in 2022, I think we only had less than 50 people who were shot or killed on school grounds. And this is independent of age. Some of these were adults that were on school grounds and not in classrooms. And so when you think about 50 versus the 40,000 we've lost, it's definitely becoming a smaller and smaller percentage of the crisis. But it's still hard to talk about, because when one of those events happen, the entire world watches it on the news. And so until we eradicate it altogether, I think it's going to continue to be a huge concern. That's why one other thing that we just recently launched is a new executive order from the president to really assess and improve the standards for active shooter drills, knowing that if we're going to talk about this and train our youth all over the country on how to react to these moments, then we have to minimize the trauma, but we also have to make sure that we're getting our schools ready and prepared, and not just, pulling them through an exercise that causes more harm than good. And so we're actually looking at how can we revamp school preparedness as a whole to ensure that we're preparing schools and not fueling this fear of something that actually is a really, really small threat, but we know is such a just paralyzing thought to have for most families.
Thank you so much. I know you said 80 days, but understand, Mr. Greg, work is not done after those 80 days. Please continue your fight. Continue to help all of those affected by gun violence and affected by crime as a whole. Peace and love.
Peace. Thank you.